So let's begin. Where's the camera? There it is. All right. So today we're gonna, the title of this in the syllabus, the class syllabus, is simply Title, Abstract, and Introduction. But you can see that this explains more. This here is guiding the reader. Because as you'll see, I believe that the title, the abstract, and the introduction is an important part of guiding the reader to what you want her or him to pay attention to in your article. Recently, I noticed something new in my city, San Francisco. I have a young son, and I saw that there's this museum here, and I thought, where's a good place to take my young son the next time I go to San Francisco at the end of the year? And somebody recommended this place here. Now, this place here in 1998 was called Zeum, and I thought that's a strange name for a place to take a child. And as it turns out, the reason I never took my son there before is because they had a problem with this name. They changed the name of this place in 2011 to this. This was the original name, and this is the name of the same place. Now, you can imagine that if you had a small child, you might not take your child to this place because you simply don't know what it is. But if you have a small child and you see something like this, then you might want to walk inside to see what it's all about. And in fact, that's what the management said in a press release. This was an important part of actually attracting people into the museum. Although Zeum sounded fun, it didn't actually tell you what it was about. And so today, big part of the message is how your title, your abstract, and your introduction is kind of like this idea of the Zeum. You want to have a title or an abstract or an introduction, all of those things together form an important part of what you want your reader to focus on, why they want to read in the first place. So today we're going to review a few of the key concepts from last week. We're also going to talk a little bit about titles and also the structure of the introduction, because you're going to start writing that very soon, actually starting today. We're going to introduce a concept to help guide your writing called problem solution approach. And then finally, we're going to look at your next assignment, which is actually starting to write. I don't know if any of you ever watched the series Friends. Anybody here ever watch Friends, the series? I used to love watching that series. And there's one episode where Phoebe, the character Phoebe, she plays guitar, not very well, but she plays guitar. And there's a friend called Joey on that show, and Joey wants to learn how to play the guitar. And so he asks Phoebe to teach him. And so she said, okay, yeah, I'll teach you. But she actually doesn't let him touch a guitar. And so he has to play like air guitar with just his hands for a while. And she said, this is for your own good. I feel a little bit like Phoebe right now. I haven't let you actually write anything yet. You haven't actually touched the guitar. You haven't touched your keys. But soon, today, you will. All right. So last week we did this little Kahoot exercise where I asked you, where do you start when you start writing an article? Where's your starting point in the IMRAD, the introduction method, results, and discussion? Where would you start? And most of you chose method. I said last week is the place where you'd start when you're conceiving. Oops. So you'd want to, when you're designing your research, when you're thinking of research, method is extremely important, because if your method is faulty, then everything else is going to be faulty. But once you have already collected data, then really when you're starting to think about your article, as we discussed last week, you'd really want to start with your data. Your data will be what drives a lot of your article, including the introduction, including even the title. Your data can help you drive where you're trying to get the reader to focus on. The data is a starting point. As we mentioned last week, you can let the story emerge organically from the data. Let the data drive your story. As we also mentioned last week, where people run into problems a lot of times is when they have a story they want to tell, and they've already decided what that story is going to be before they actually start writing, letting the data tell the story. And where that becomes problematic is when you start telling a story and you don't look at what the data is really saying and start offending the naysayer who starts saying, well, wait a minute, that's not what your data is saying. That's not the story your data is telling. You're telling a story that doesn't match your data. So letting your data drive that story, drive your research, drive your article is a really important thing. So really, I think many of you don't have data yet, but as soon as you do have data, that's where you want to start your writing, really, in your head at least. And some of you wrote about this. So here's a good example. I'll let you read that. So I found this very interesting. The subject itself is very interesting. How there are these species, Brazilian species representative of Brazilian biodiversity, and they are in the market somehow. And I guess this was some kind of exploratory research where they're looking to see how many are actually out there. It's very interesting. But the second part of what the person says here says that where I'm still in the data collection phase, this last sentence, this is maybe more representative of everybody. Most people are in the data collection phase still, just like this person here, forming, and that's okay. By the end of today's class, I'm going to give you some alternatives because a lot of you, at least 50% of you, are in this condition right here, where you don't have any data really to help drive that story. I also asked you what your number 2 is, or your second move, as it's called in cars. I'll let you read that. Here's another example. So there's a couple of, lots of really good examples from people who have already begun to think about what their move 2 is, and that's good. You're building awareness that's a good thing to have in your introduction. So many of you talked about, well, this is the conversation I'm entering. This is the they say, this is the I say. And that's a really good awareness to have, like this person here. That's nice. This one too. So this person clearly says, well, they say this amintoses doesn't cause economic damage. I say they do. I say it does. So I also asked you about the naysayer, this guy here, and again, this is just an awareness raising. You guys are now beginning to become aware that this person exists. You'll see him again, especially when we start talking about the discussion section. You'll see this guy come up many times. Here's what one student wrote. So this person's focusing on the method section. A lot of people focused on the method section where the naysayer could arise. Here's another example of that. This word aleatoriedade seemed to come up many times. There are people worried about this in their method. That's good. The naysayer, he will come up many times in the method section. That's where a lot of articles can get rejected or questioned. But the method section, or rather, the method section is not the only place where the naysayer can come up. The naysayer, he can show up in other places too, on much more micro levels. So, for example, I'm going to show you a few simple, what appear like simple sentences. And you tell me, or you don't tell me out loud, but think, can you hear that if you write this, a naysayer might say, really? Or this? Or and only this? Or this? I'd like you to take just 1 minute and discuss with a person next to you, if you're here present, and if you're watching this broadcast online. If you have other people around you, you can also discuss this, or just think for a minute. What's the problem? What's the possible problem in terms of a naysayer for these 3 sentences? And what could you do? How could you change it to fix it? Go ahead. Okay. So, some considerations. First of all, you obviously, as I mentioned last week, the people who will be reading your manuscript, they don't necessarily, you can't assume that they're going to love your work, or they're already convinced before they start reading. And so you don't want to invite criticism unnecessarily. You want to show proper reservedness or reservation, or hedging as it's called, so that you don't kind of unnecessarily raise someone's skepticism. So with the first one here, you can see that there has been no research on this topic. This absolute affirmation of no research is just, even though there may be no research, it's almost like an invitation for the naysayer to say, really? And with the second one, you say that the subject has already been well established. Well, yes, if it's only you saying that, that might be a problem too. So what's missing here maybe is simply a citation or two of the literature. And the third one, the results of this research conclusively prove, this is similar to the first one. It's sort of very unnecessarily confident. It's overly confident. And especially, as you'll see later in a few weeks in the discussion section, this can irritate a reviewer, saying, well, this is kind of a lot of confidence from this researcher to say that it conclusively prove, since in the sciences there's very little that is really conclusively proven, especially the social sciences. So the first one, here's an example of how it could be fixed with this little bit, this little section, this little phrase here at the beginning. This is what's called a hedge. A hedge is a little linguistic device so that you show, I'm trying to be careful here. So, to the best of our knowledge, there is little or no research. It's hard to argue against this here. It's harder for the naysayer to raise his critical eye when you say something like this, to the best of our knowledge. Another one, the second one, simply adding a citation here, in this case, several citations, 9 citations, then you say, well, it's just not just me saying that, it's the literature as well asserting this. And then finally, instead of saying prove, there are many synonyms that you could use, such as this here. The results of this research provide compelling evidence. Not only does it sound elegant, but it shows that you're being a bit more reserved about your assertion or your confidence of what you're saying. You're saying almost the same thing. It's very strong evidence, but you're saying it in a way that reduces the likelihood of a naysayer being irritated by your confidence. And you'll see in a few weeks when we talk about the discussion section how there are many synonyms such as suggest or point to or show instead of the word prove. Okay, so that's just to show you that the naysayer, he can pop up in anywhere in the article, not just in the method section. Now, as I mentioned last week, the IMRAD section, even though the IMRAD structure is separate, it kind of has this configuration where it starts broadly, narrows down to method result, and then opens up again to discussion, but they're also always connected. And this connectedness is really important, the fact that one is connected to another. So in the introduction section, I talked about how the authors create a research space. This section is connected to the other sections that come after it, and as we'll see in a minute, even to things that come before it. So I asked you for homework to look at this, just this introduction. This is the entire introduction section here. Divided into 2 sections, really. This first bit here, where you have move 1, and that's all territory. And then here in cars would be move 2, establishing a niche. And then finally occupying the niche. But there were 2 howevers here. And it was this however that was the move 2. And you know that, and the key thing here was not just the however, but what came after the however. However, it is an open question. In other words, this is the unknown. This is what we don't know yet. Now, you can find that a good abstract will also often have a cause structure and an IMRAD structure in it. So for example, the first sentence here is already, or the first 2 sentences are already establishing territory. Look at these blue dots here. Can you identify IMRAD here? This first part here is basically the introduction in the abstract. It's there. Then they talk about method there. Then the results. And finally, the implications or the discussion. And a good abstract will already have this in it. Not all abstracts do, but it certainly doesn't hurt to have this structure already represented in your abstract. And here, you can see you have the territory, move 1. Previous qualitative research has shown that scientists writing English in a second language face difficulties. And then the second part of that sentence is move 2. Establishing the niche. And the authors put this right at the beginning. In other words, somebody receiving this manuscript, if they look right at the abstract, they can see what's the purpose of this article and what is its contribution, already in the first 2 sentences. There's not a mystery. Whoever receives this manuscript, imagine somebody submits this manuscript, the person receiving it sees very clearly, okay, here's what is known and here's what is new. This is the contribution, this is the niche that they are occupying. Right there. And so these 2 things are interconnected, and when the reviewer is checking if a manuscript should be published or not, they can easily say, okay, yes, it contains new information, and yes, the problem is concisely stated. They can answer those questions affirmatively. And between that, you see that the abstract is right in the middle. Does the abstract or summary clearly and accurately describe the content of the article? And so those first 3 things there, the new and significant information, the abstract, and the problem, all of that should be clear as early as possible in the manuscript. Perhaps even in the title, as we'll see in a minute. So if those are our 3 moves, the territory, the niche, occupying the niche, first part talking about the importance, what the conversation is, mentioning the gap, saying what the gap will be filled. Where do the problems start? The problems start is when you skip one of those steps, either in the abstract or in the introduction or both. So, for example, let's look at this is a fake abstract. There is a growing concern that people are not getting enough sleep. Moreover, there is increasing evidence of an association between sleep and adult health. However, there is still little research on how much sleep older adults need. This retrospective cohort study examined reported sleep duration and possible associations with health concerns. Results show that older adults generally require less sleep than younger adults. Here you can see there's IMRAD, and you can see the moves, where however, as is often the case, however, the word however, marks the niche. There's still a little research on how much sleep older adults need. So that's good. That's an okay abstract. There's your territory. There's your niche, move 1 and move 2, and then occupying the niche. Okay. But where a lot of, I don't know what happened here, but that's supposed to be, number 2 is supposed to be crossed out. That's where a lot of problems begin, is when people skip number 2. And this is what you saw in the article from last week, and it was really common in Brazilian published articles, is that the number 2 was missing. You had number 1 and number 3. So that actually it looks more like this. Something like this makes it difficult or more difficult for the editor of the journal, the reviewer of a manuscript, to be able to identify what's new, what's the contribution. And the same thing with number 1. Often, in my experience, even this is skipped, so that sometimes you see abstracts that look just like this. And here, the authors are not situating their research in a conversation. They're not saying what they are responding to, what conversation they are entering. There's no they say. And that makes it hard to identify why it's worth reading this manuscript, why this research is important. Just a relevant anecdote. My father, when he was a teenager, apparently his first job was selling vacuum cleaners. For the Kirby company. And this is 1950s. And the Kirby company used to pay people to go door to door and sell vacuum cleaners across the United States. I think actually they still do. And apparently, according to what my father used to tell me, the vacuum cleaner model that he had was one that had a case that was transparent. So in other words, whenever you vacuumed something, you could see the dirt going inside the vacuum cleaner. You could see the dirt going inside the vacuum cleaner. One of the sales techniques that the Kirby company used to train their salespeople to do was to offer to vacuum someone's bed sheets. So they would encourage salespeople to actually go to a person's bedroom and say, I will vacuum your bed sheets for you. And then he said that when he did, sure enough, he would vacuum someone's bed sheets, and he could see through that transparent tube, he could see all kinds of disgusting dirt and stuff go inside there. And the person seeing that, the owner of the bed, would be so ashamed and so embarrassed and just so shocked that they would often be compelled to buy the vacuum cleaner. So, of course, it's an analogy here. What I'm trying to point out, I'm trying to make, is that because he could make the problem so clear to the potential buyer of the vacuum cleaner, of the machine, it was easy for them to see the size of the problem, the gravity of the problem, and thus make a compelling case that the machine should be bought. To some extent, you are also trying to sell something when you're submitting an article, not to put a mercantile spin on it, but it's true. You're trying to make a kind of sales pitch. You're trying to sell something. As you say in Portuguese, vendendo seu peixe, a little bit, your research, when you submit a manuscript for consideration. And therefore, the larger, the more clear, the clearer, the more substantial that you can show the problem to be, the more likely the reader will want to see what your solution is to the problem. Want to believe that your research is something worth buying. And so that's what drives the CARS model, is that you're creating a space to sell that research. You're creating a research space as early as possible in the introduction. So getting back to our IMRAD structure, I would argue that the title is also part of that, part of the selling that you should do, something that you should consider very carefully. Can I see a show of hands here in this room? Have you already, who here already has a title for their next article? Very few people have actually thought of a title. And that's common. When I ask this question to people in graduate school about if they already have a title, most people say no. Most people, especially those who haven't even collected data yet, in their second semester of their doctoral program, they haven't thought of a title yet. I think about parents who get pregnant, couple of parents. Now, if you know somebody who's expecting a baby, what's one of the first questions you ask that person? You say, "Oh, is it a boy or a girl? And do you have a name already?" Even if it's just a few months, usually the parents have already thought of a name. I mean, it's very rare that they can say, "No, I don't care. I'm only going to think about names when the baby's born." When the baby is still in utero, often the people already personify it. They give the girl or a boy a name because it allows them to think ahead. They start planning the room, start thinking about what clothes they want to buy and what color they want to paint the bedroom, and they start imagining scenarios where they're talking to the person and so on. It's something that they hang on to. Giving a child a name, it suddenly gives a personality almost to the child. And so I liken the dissertation and the thesis to not having a name for your baby. It's sometimes good to have a name or a title already, because the title already at this stage, even at the earliest stages, if you're already thinking of a title, that means you're already thinking of what direction you want to send your reader or your readers in the future. Not just a big general question, but what is it that you want the reader to pay attention to? What's special? What's interesting about your research? And if you have a title, that can help already. So we're going to start talking a little bit about titles now. And it's interesting, there isn't a lot of research about titles, and there should be. So I'd like you to read this abstract here for a second. Because actually a lot of you have heard the situation before, right? Many of you who have taken English classes before, or even study any other foreign language, you've heard about the situation where people say, I'm not a good speaker of English, or I'm not a good speaker of French, or whatever, but if I have a beer or two, then suddenly I'm super fluent. And certainly, I sometimes feel that way after a caipirinha, that I feel like my Portuguese can get better. And you'll see later in today's class, there actually is now real research to show this. The abstract I'm going to show you now is not a real abstract, but it's kind of modeled after a real abstract. So read this abstract about that situation for a second. Now, I can't imagine how somebody could go through an ethics committee to get this research done. Apparently it was done, though, something quite similar to this. So with this abstract in mind, I'm going to show you 4 titles. And I'd like you to look at these titles and think, which title is best for this abstract? Okay, do you have a favorite? All right, let's do a quick poll. This is for the people here and also the people watching online. You're going to go into Kahoot, and you tell me which title you like most. All right, so that's your game pin. 364528. Leave it some more time this time so that people have time to get in.
days per class, or else it gets too complicated. Any questions or anything so far? No? Okay, here we go. I left more time this time so people can respond. ¿Cuál palabra? By the way, the word for today's attendance is title. The first attendance. Aha. Okay, that's interesting. So the most popular option was focusing on the effects of consuming alcoholic beverages on foreign language fluency. The second one, second favorite is the red one. Can drinking alcohol make you speak a foreign language more fluently? Evidence from can't remember, it's a quasi-experimental study. And then the third one, drinking alcohol positively affects, so that's the focus is on the result. The least favorite one, and I would have to agree with this one, is was the highly technical one, the blue one. Although an argument can be made that maybe for certain journals it would be more appropriate. All right, let's take a closer look at these title structures, because there's no such thing as one title being better than another, or in terms of its structure, but it's something that you need to think about, which one is better for your particular research. Okay, today we'll be looking at these 8, believe it or not, there are more than 8, title types. Transparent, meaning sort of your typical Wikipedia title. Number 2, finding, or what you say in Portuguese, achado, or it's focusing on a finding. The third one, a title that focuses on implication or application. Fourth one, method focused. 5, a title that is a question. Number 6, a title that focuses on the effect. Number 7, one that has an elaboration explaining more about the title. And then number 8, one that includes a quote. And then there are many titles that are kind of a mix of these. So let's go one by one. An example of a transparent title, just starting with Portuguese here. I love to talk about rain in Curitiba. Very simple, transparent title. Just like this here. Very descriptive. Costs of hospital malnutrition. Sort of Wikipedia-like. I have an article like this. This is what it is. And I chose this title for this research because I was entering a conversation with this. I chose this journal, the Applied Linguistics Journal, because there had been an article published some years before called the Academic Vocabulary List, the Academic Word List, AWL. And I was adding a new list that would focus on academic phrases, or focus on phrases, and that was kind of a kind of response to that. I was entering that conversation, and so I wanted my title to sound like that other title that I was responding to in the same journal in which that original publication appeared. So I chose that particular title for that reason. Very transparent title, clearly in response to a research that happened before that was linked to it. Okay, titles that focus on finding. Here's an example. This is true, right? This happens all the time. So this would be a finding from a study. This is what they want to focus on. This they want the reader to see. This is the main finding. Here's another example, a real example, from the Journal of Science and Food Agriculture. 1-MCP does not improve the shelf life of Chinese cabbage. That's the finding they want to highlight. There it is. This is a very funny title, if you look at it. Exposure to tourism reduces stress-induced corticosterone levels in Galapagos marine iguanas. That's the finding they're highlighting. But I can't help but think of an image like this. These iguanas that have no stress because their corticosterone levels have been reduced because they're hanging out at some resort somewhere. And anyway, how did they, I don't know how they measured this, I guess sort of chemically, because I'm assuming they didn't interview the iguanas or anything. Then a title that focuses on implication or application. This is also very common. It's kind of like how you do this. This is the application, the implication of a study is you do this in order to reduce the chances of forgetting your umbrella. Here's another example from the journal Corrosion Science. Improving the chemical dealloying of amorphous AU alloys. I'm not even sure how to pronounce that. But same thing. They're kind of saying this is how you do it. This is its application. All right, a title that's method-focused. Simulating sulfuric acid dew point corrosion of enamels with different contents of silica. They're saying this is what we did. This was the process that we did. Another example, physical activity in relation to urban environments in 14 cities worldwide, a cross-sectional study. So they're saying this is the method that we adopted. We adopted a cross-sectional study of this. For some reason, for whatever reason, the authors are highlighting the method in the title already. There must be a reason for it. And obviously it was successful because it was published. Social media competitive analysis and text mining, a case study in the pizza industry. Again, they're focusing on the fact that this was a case study. Maybe it's already to say, we're not saying that this applies to everything, but it was just the pizza industry that we looked at as a case study. They're already maybe even anticipating a naysayer in this, and they're saying this is the area that we're confident of making this assertion. So they're highlighting the method already in the title. This is from the International Journal of Information Management. Then you have titles that are actually questions or that include a question, like this one. Often it's because it's something that people are interested in knowing more about. It's a question that is often it's for research that's exploratory in nature. So here is a real example of a Journal of Research and Personality. Is doing your homework associated with becoming more conscientious? It's almost like they're provoking the reader. Oh, that's interesting. Is it? Another one. What is the manner of gastric emptying after ingestion of liquids with differences in the volume under uniform glucose-based energy content? So the question they asked, they posed that question. For whatever reason, they decided this was the best way to pose this question. Okay, then you have titles that focus on an effect. These are very common as well. It's usually the effect of X on Y. So here you have effects of inulin-type fructans, galacto-oligosaccharides, and related symbiotics on inflammatory markers in adult patients with overweight obesity. A systematic review. But I didn't get any applause for being able to say that in one breath. Here you can see already that you have in the title a focus on the effect, but you also have something to do with a method, really. So it's kind of mixed. I have an article like this. I wanted to highlight the fact that word frequency had an effect, and also what's called idiomaticity had an effect on reading comprehension. And that's what I chose to highlight for this research. Then you have titles that kind of explain, add information, or elaborate on something. So here you have an example. So the second part of the title is elaboration on the first. Here you have a real example. Who receives oral nutrition supplements in nursing homes? And they're answering the question, results from the Nutritional Day Project. So the second part of this is an elaboration on the first part of the title. I have an article like this, Listening for Needles in Haystacks, How Lecturers Introduce Key Terms. I couldn't just leave the first part. The first part I chose, Listening for Needles in Haystacks, because I thought it was a metaphor that was perfect for the nature of my study, which was that when people lecture, when professors give their classes, often the key points they want to make get lost because they're not really well highlighted or well signaled. And so the image of a needle in a haystack I thought was perfect. It was okay for this title, but I had to elaborate on that, so I added How Lecturers Introduce Key Terms. Then you have titles that include a quote, a quotation. So often this is something that is an in vivo quote from somebody's testimonial or an interview. You often take a quote and you include it in the title. Just like this here. That's not my job. Developing flexible employee work orientations. It doesn't have to be, though, an actual quotation from a participant. It could be something that conceptually helps capture the essence of a collective consciousness or opinions. Another example, I can't lie to your face. Minimal face-to-face interaction promotes honesty. And of course, as we saw last week, you guys read this article, I have that too. And I chose this because I felt anyway, that people who received this title, this manuscript, especially if they were highly proficient speakers of English, they would notice that there was something strange about this quotation, that it wasn't sort of conforming to canonical uses of the language, this, especially in the last years, which I would write more like, first of all, especially, there's an E missing for me in this, especially in recent years or something like that. But this, especially in the last years, sounded to me, not only did it sound to me like something that would catch readers' attention, but I knew, and from my own research, that these are constructions that people read often in manuscripts, and they might think, that sounds strange. And so I thought this is going to catch their attention, really kind of send a signal that this article contains more information about these kind of funny constructions, or funny to native speakers, and then an elaboration, evidence of ELF and non-native English forms. You have also mixed hybrid, as I mentioned before. So here you have neurodevelopmental disorders are highly overrepresented in children with obesity, a cross-sectional study. So here you have the first one, which is sort of just a transparent descriptive title, and then an elaboration on that. So it's not like you have just one and another, like a number 1 title, a number 8, or a number 4, a number 7, or a number 7. You can have, often you see mixed titles. The important thing here is that you're aware of the many options that exist, so that you can think which one is the best one for my particular study. What's going to really get the reader to see the most important thing, what my contribution is, and why it's interesting, without getting overcomplicated. So in this abstract here that you read, this is the original article that inspired this abstract. It's not the real abstract, but this is a real study from the Journal of Psychopharmacology. Dutch Courage, Effects of Acute Alcohol Consumption on Self-Ratings and Observer Ratings of Foreign Language Skills. Okay, first of all, about this title. You can say that it was published, and so it's successful, at least to that extent. The reason that they call it Dutch Courage, though, this is where it gets a bit tricky. Because, first of all, you may not realize, or many of you might not know, that Dutch Courage is an informal way of saying when you have too much to drink, or you have a little bit, or you have something to drink, and so you do something that you normally wouldn't do. So, if one friend might say to another friend, I really like that person, I think that person's very attractive, but I need to get some Dutch courage before I go talk to that person. That would be drinking alcohol. But the reason that they chose Dutch courage for this particular study is because it was English speakers learning Dutch. And so you have to know both those things in order for this title to make sense. I think that that's actually a limitation of this title, because if, as y'all know, most of the world are not native speakers of English, most of the world won't know this expression, Dutch courage, and so it might seem strange. It kind of distracts more than adds something. It's interesting, it's clever, but I would say that that's a drawback, a shortcoming of that title. The rest, effects of alcohol on self-ratings, observer ratings. Well, here you can see that you have an effect of something on title, but you also have method included there, where they're including ratings, self-ratings and observer ratings within the title. I could also, in addition, then also say an argument could be made that maybe there's too much information in this title. Maybe if they had just kept it a little bit more succinct, more to the point, maybe it would have a bigger impact, to the extent that this is published a year ago and it only has 3 citations for a journal that usually has more citations than that. And also a subject that you'd think we cited more. I don't know. This is a real title, by the way. This here that I'm showing you now is a real title, but I should also add that the first part is this AMG 145 is the first part of the title, and under that is an elaboration of the title. So what you see here, what I will read to you now, is the entire title of this article. AMG 145, a monoclonal antibody against protein convertase subtilism kexin type 9 significantly reduces lipoprotein A in hypercholesterolemic patients receiving statin therapy, 2 points, colon. An analysis from LDL-C assessment with pro-protein convertase, subtilism, kexin 9, monoclonal antibody inhibition combined with statin therapy, blah, 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 blah. This is a real title. It's an exaggeration. I'm giving you something that's really over the top. But what do you think about a title like this? You get tired just looking at it, right? I mean, it's almost like they've included the whole article in the title, in the journal Coronary Heart Disease. This is an exaggeration, but it's not. It doesn't happen all that rarely that you see titles that are too long. When do you see titles that are too long? Often it's when somebody wants to include too much information in a title because they feel like, oh, I have to include this, I have to include this, I have to include this in their title. But really, you have to try to think of that reader. What's going to really kind of grab the essence, the main point that you want to make? You can't make your titles too long. And there's research that shows that there is a correlation between title length and citation rate. So here you have a study that was published in, 2015, where they say the advantage of short paper titles, and they talk about this research. And they say these results are consistent with the intriguing hypothesis that papers with shorter titles may be easier to understand and hence attract more citations. Of course, our attention rates aren't growing longer in recent years, and we don't have less information to focus on nowadays. And so the more succinct that you can make a title often makes it easier for the person to say, okay, oh, I see, this is the main point here. If I look at my own, my top articles that are most cited, most of them are quite short. Imagine, you all know this film here, this movie. Star Wars. It describes what they want to say. Imagine if Star Wars had been called this: the story of a young man who became a Jedi to fight an evil empire, but then learns that the leader of the empire is actually his dad. Something tells me that even in 1977, people wouldn't have lined up around the block to watch this film. There wasn't even an option. So while results do drive your introduction, I would also argue that results can also drive the title that you decide to give your research. That should help you decide which of those options is best for me. There is no one that's better than the other. The only guidelines, here are the options, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are different common types of titles, and also don't make it too long. But then you have to decide which one is best for you. Do you know about these guys in Japan? They're called pushmen. This guy here with the armband. They're called pushmen. That's the name that they have, pushmen, in Tokyo, the subway. And during rush hour in Tokyo, sometimes their cars get so packed with people that they actually have these people who are employees of the subway to push the passengers inside so that they can all fit inside the car. And this image here reminds me of the way people try to pack in so much information from their thesis or their dissertation into an article. And that's what happens, these long titles that you see. Often it's because of this. Somebody trying to include their entire dissertation or their entire thesis in just one title. But you have to try to whittle it down. So you have a research space that's made clear right from the beginning, as you saw here, where the introduction, in this case, is only these 2 paragraphs. Just that. introduction doesn't have to always be this short, but you can see that they're able to make their point that clearly in just the introduction. Titles can also do the same thing. Okay. There is another way to look at this information here. If you recall, there were two however words. There's the first however and the second however. And Michael Hoey, he proposes a kind of system called the problem-solution approach, where in academic writing, according to Michael Hoey, he notices that academic writers often propose first a situation, where the current situation is, what the situation is, often as a kind of problem situation, and then poses the problem. So here's a situation, but there's a problem with that situation. And then a response to that problem, and then eventually at the end of articles, often coming full circle to here's what we did, here's the solution, and then bringing the solution back to the problem. So in introduction, we'll often have the situation, the background, then the problem with that situation, then how the researcher responded to that problem, then the results of what that solution was, and then bring it back in the discussion section, the end of the article, to the original problem, recontextualizing it. Situation, problem, response, result. So let me show you now how this looks like in real life, some real examples, using what you've already seen. So, as you read already in this article, the Mexican scientist article, the authors, Englander and Hanauer, they say, the world of scientific publication is dominated by the English language. That's an assertion that they make. Then, research over the last 3 decades has shown a continual increase in the percentage of scientific publications in English from 66% in the 1980s to 89% or 90% at the end of the 20th century. Okay. This, you could say, is territory. It's move one. But also, as you saw before, you could say that this is the current situation. This is the situation now. And the however comes after this is the first however. However, while the vast majority of scientific publication might be in English, the scientists producing knowledge and who desire to disseminate their findings are not necessarily first language speakers. This is not move two. This is still territory. But under the problem solution scheme, you can see this here as the problem with the situation. Here's the situation, but here's the problem. And this here is a little different. It's very similar to, but it's a little different from cars, because what's happening here? What's happening here is the person's building an argument. They're using that vacuum cleaner a little bit. They're showing you the extent of the problem. They're showing the situation and the problem with that situation. So I like cars, but I also like the problem solution way of seeing an article, because it perhaps more clearly shows how arguments are built over the writing process. And in some areas, for example, the social sciences, in many of the social sciences and the humanities, where there aren't real primary data in order to drive an article, oftentimes you don't have a lot of quantitative methods in the humanities. You might have literature, for example, poetry, philosophy. In those areas, a situation problem solution focus is maybe more appropriate than move one, move two, and move three. Here, the person is showing the extent of the problem, building an argument. So, to look at the big scheme of things, the green part is the situation, the red part is the problem with that situation. Then, focusing in on the second part, Research has established that scientists are required to publish their scientific research in English as a second language face difficulties. This is their claim. This is their assertion. And then we come to the second, however, and that's where, under Swale's scheme, you have move to the territory, the niche. But under the Hoey's situation problem solution approach, this is still a situation. This is a situation. And this here is the problem with that situation. Many researchers have to write in English, but and that they have a problem with that. That's accepted. But it's an open question as to if it's more difficult in English than in their first language. That is the problem with that situation. So it's just another way of looking at that structure. And then here you have the solution. So here you have the situation, the problem, and then they talk about the solution, or rather, sorry, the response to the problem that they're bringing in this particular article. Same article, different way of analyzing it. This analysis is not better than cars. It's just another way of looking at it. And I'm giving you these possibilities so that when you start to conceive and start writing your introductions, you have different ways of writing it. But also, I hope that this plants a seed for you as well, so that when you start reading articles in your areas, you start seeing or deconstructing introductions and seeing these moves that authors make. So getting back to this, you had a situation, you had the problem with the situation, problem, and response. And so that's the way the introduction looks using that kind of analysis. Either way, cars or problem solution, they're both a good way of constructing the introduction. So to compare, under cars you have move 1, English is a language of science, but many scientists are not native speakers of English. Move 2, we know that non-native speakers have difficulty, but we do not know if that difficulty is greater than in their first language. And move 3, we will quantify their burden in each language. Establishing territory, establishing niche, occupying the niche. The problem solution, you have English is a language of science, situation. Problem, many scientists are not native speakers of English. Situation, we know that non-native speakers have difficulty. Problem, we do not know if that difficulty is greater than in their first language. So, the response of the authors, we quantified their burden in each language. Same article, 2 different ways of analyzing it. You can look at articles now, your own articles that you write and the articles that you read, using this awareness of cars and problem solution, and go deeper and even look at the language, the English that they're using to do that. So with that awareness of this structure, you can also look at the grammar inside these sections. What words do they use? What phrases do they use? Do they use past simple for grammar? Do they use present perfect? How are they using the English? And analyze that, and here's where I can authorize plagiarism. Don't be afraid to look at how they're writing, the words they're using, and write these words down and copy that. Don't copy ideas, but copy the way people write those ideas. So, for example, here, we saw this already. You've read this already. But notice that the red part here is the situation. And the green part is, or rather I should say the first part there is territory really, or situation and problem. But notice the first, notice the tense that they're using. The world of scientific publication is dominated by. As many of you already have learned in your basic English classes, the present simple is often used for factual information. It rains a lot in Curitiba. It's a fact. So the same applies a more complex level of writing. They're making this assertion, they're making this claim as a fact. It is dominated by simple present. But then you notice that when they're covering what other people have done, what other research has been published in this area, what tense are they using? What aspect? They're using the present perfect. Research over the last 3 decades has shown, has made a claim. They're showing what's been happened, the territory. So when people establish territory, they often use present perfect. This is something that you can see on your own. There's no grammatical rule about which tense you should use, present simple or present perfect, when you write. But if you're aware of the moves, move 1, move 2, then you can say, okay, I want to signal here that I'm making a factual assertion, or I want to signal here that I'm establishing territory through the grammar. And this is argument building. This is using that vacuum cleaner to show the problem. You can also say that this here is they say, and then I say. So this is building an argument. This is about argument building. Another way to say this is that when you build an argument, you're making a claim, and then you're backing up that claim. You're warranting that claim. So here is an important point about, you have to be careful of just about making claims without warranting, without backing that up, because that's how you wake up the naysayer. So here, for example, look at these 2 assertions, these 2 claims. An umbrella is, or the first claim, an umbrella is a necessary item in Curitiba. I recommend you buy an umbrella. Okay, if I'm talking to you, that's fine, nothing strange about that. But if you're writing a journal article, where's the problem? The problem is in the first sentence. You're making a claim without any evidence for it, or not backing it up or explaining what you mean. This would be an example of what's called warranting, or backing up what you say. So be careful when you make claims without warrants. This is an argument. An argument is claims plus warranting. That's argument building. That's what authors, academic authors, do throughout their work. An argument is a claim backed up, warranted by evidence. And you can apply this concept to any length of a text, from sentence to the whole dissertation, a book, or an entire article, or throughout IMRAD, introduction, method, results, and discussion. All of that should include claims and warranting. So when you start writing your introductions, which you'll start to do hopefully today, look through your text and say to yourself, am I making a claim somewhere? And if I am, which you should be, if I'm making a claim, have I warranted? Is the claim warranted? Or am I waking up a naysayer here? So you can see this also as claims and warranting. The world of scientific publication is dominated by the English language. That's a claim. Research over the last 3 decades has shown a continual increase, so now you're explaining this evidence for that claim. You're warranting. Okay, now, I'm going to talk a little bit about this Control-C and Control-V. We're going to talk a little bit today about good copying and bad copying. Now, the good copying is what I just showed you now. And there's a lot of ways, people always talk about plagiarism is a bad thing, and it is a bad thing. Plagiarism is a bad thing. But there's good plagiarism. There's plagiarism of looking at good models of text that you read every day probably, and looking at, I should use this in my work. I should pay attention to the way people write things. So I do this, for example, when I read someone's tese or dissertação. If I'm a banca member, I often just underline things that I think are interesting. Maybe I can use this. Like, here's an example. I read this in somebody's thesis, and esta pesquisa empenha-se em... I didn't know what aferir meant. I had to go to the dictionary and what aferir was. And then I said, that sounds very elegant. I might be able to use that again and sound very impressive. I can use this at a cocktail party sometime. Esta pesquisa empenha-se em aferir. So I wrote that down in my phone, actually. And then here's another example from the same person. Principalmente ao que cerne ante... Wow, that's, again, I don't know if this is, good or not, but it sounded good to me. That's better than I would write it. I'd probably write something really weird. So, okay, here's a native speaker of Portuguese. They're writing something that sounds elegant to me. I'm going to make a note of that. And so I have this little on my phone. I have this section of words and phrases that if I don't know what to say, if I want to sound impressive in an academic text, I've got these things. The thing is that you can't just read any text for this. It has to be text from your area. Now, the good news is that's what you're doing already anyway. You are all reading text in your area. And the specific words that people use, the best way of saying something will depend on every subdiscipline area of knowledge. So here's an example from that same paragraph of something you could, as an example, highlight. Research over the last 3 decades has shown a continual increase in... This is not plagiarism. If you copy this directly, if you do a Control-C, Control-V, you can probably find the exact same sentence thousands of times written, in maybe with small permutations, in Google Scholar. But this is a formulaic way people use to signal that they're establishing territory. So if you see this, be aware of it, underline it, and say, I can use something like this. You're not plagiarizing. You're just saying, research over the last number of years has shown a continuing... This is okay to highlight, and this is okay to Control-C and Control-V. Yeah? Yes? Abstract? The attendance word now is abstract. Abstract. Here, you might say, okay, Hamel has made the claim that, and you could substitute Hamel 2007 for Fulano 2012, and has made the claim that, and that will sound perfectly fine, and you're not plagiarizing this author. You're just saying what a bunch of other academic authors write exactly the same way. Remember what I said on the first day of this class, that nobody's born an academic author, something that you learned. Nobody's a native author of academic English. And they learn to speak this language here. Fulano blah blah has made the claim that, and it's a safe way of saying it because it's the way a lot of people write it. You can Control-C and Control-V that, and it's good plagiarism. Even this here, Hamel has made the claim that there is a rapid trend toward... So you can see there are many ways that you can do that in every article that you read, with an awareness of cars, with awareness of problem solution, these different sections, and what words and what phrases people use to express themselves in these sections. Here, for example, you'll see articles, hopefully you'll see articles with these colors. Just like this. And begin to highlight these little phrases that signal these moves. Like, it is an open question. Again, this is not, if you write this down and you copy it, it's not plagiarism. It's good learning for you. here you see, you can look at this also as claim and warranting, where the person is saying, this is an open question, and then they're warranting it. In other words, the actual increased burden, they're explaining that. So use your Control-C, Control-V, but because you're noticing the words and phrases that authors use. Even here, the way they signal, okay, now I'm entering move 3. The aim of this article is to, or a response. The aim of this article is to blah, blah, blah. Okay. Here's another example from the area of genetics. The title here is Genetic Adaptation and Neanderthal Admixture Shaped the Immune System of Human Populations. This is what kind of title? A finding. I would say it's a finding. This is what they found, or what they're assuming, their claim. This is the conversation that they're entering here. This is very common now in journals to have this in brief section and a graphical abstract, which you'll learn about in a couple of weeks. And in this summary, you can see already ways in which they express themselves through these moves. So the first part, humans differ in their outcome that follows exposure to life-threatening pathogens. Claim, or situation, or move 1, territory. Yet the extent of population differences in immune responses and their genetic and evolutionary determinants remain undefined. Okay, so that's the problem, or that's the move 2. This is what they're saying. This is what we don't know yet. But look at the way they say that. This evolutionary determinants remain undefined. And maybe you wouldn't have thought of saying it something that way, but it signals this remain unanswered, or remain undefined, or remain uninvestigated. You'll see this often in academic texts, and so you could highlight that. And then, with a simple little word, here, just that word, here, not in this work, not in this paper, just here, comma, we characterize, and that's the way they wrote it, and probably in this area, there are many authors who write just this way. Maybe the word here in this position would sound strange to somebody writing, for example, on Shakespeare studies, maybe. But in this area, it's something that comes up often. So if you're in the genetics area, you'd want to look at, okay, what are the ways how do the authors signal these moves? And keep a note of them. Okay. So every area has its own specificities. In this class, I can show you where to look. I can point you in the right direction, but it's up to you to do the detective work in your particular areas. So here, for example, in the International Journal of Information Management, in many journal articles in this area, and especially in this journal, you see this, something like this here. The remainder of the paper is organized as follows, and they always provide this kind of roadmap for the article. Section 2 is a brief review of text mining. Section 3 explains blah, blah, blah. Section 4 discusses da, da, da. Section 5 discusses da, da, da. And that's the way they structure it. But if you do this in the applied linguistics area, or if you do this in, I don't know, a bunch of areas, they think it's strange. Like, why is the author including this in the paper? But for this journal in this area, it's very common to do that. So in all your areas, you might have moves, you might have structures that are different. But it doesn't matter. You can analyze it and say, okay, is organized as follows. I should underline this, Control-C, Control-V, because that's something that people say in this area. And then present simple. Section 2 is blah, blah, blah. Section 3 explains, da, da, da. Section 4 discusses, da, da, da. Section 5 discusses. Section 6 concludes. Okay, you notice the grammar. They're using present simple. And then you can say, and also I can see that they often use the word explain and discuss and conclude. Okay, you make a note of that too. Until today, probably many of you are reading your articles only thinking of content, interpreting graphs, tables, things like that. Now, I'm asking you to look at your articles in a different way. Look at the articles like linguistic detectives and see cars, see problem solution, see grammar, see vocabulary, and make a note of it. Notice it, and hopefully today will help plant that seed for you guys. The other thing I highly recommend is choose a mentor text. You all have mentors. Most of you have mentors who are often your supervisors or your advisors. Choose texts and that you want to use as models. Good articles. And sometimes your own advisors can tell you which ones are good. They say, I like the structure of this article. This article is very good. It's very well written, highly cited paper. And use those as models for yourself. And say, okay, when you're writing your introduction, when you're writing your methods section, whatever section you're writing your paper on, say, how did that guy write this? Or how did he say that? Or how did she write that? And use it as a mentor. So choose a mentor text. And look how the authors use the results section to drive the introduction. And also, now you can pay attention to the titles they use as well and think of, okay, which title is best for my research? Sorry, I just want to check something. Yep. Okay, we still have time to talk about your data. Now, a lot of you have said that I haven't collected data yet. And so I want to give you options. Those of you who have data collected, great, who are already in your final phases of data collection, you have something that can drive your article. But many of you don't have data. And so if you don't have data, that's okay. There are options for you. First of all, try to remember that the objective of writing the article for this class is not because I want to torture you or cause you headaches. And I always want you to look at everything that we do in this class as kind of edifying, something that will help you in the future. So the article that you produce by the end of this class and everything that contributes to it is so that you go through the experience of actually writing an article in English. And that you would eventually use that article that you produce by the beginning of next year for this class as a template, at least, for your future articles. So that whenever you write the articles that you're really going to submit to a journal, you can go back and say, now what was it? How did I do that again? How did I write that in that article here? You can use it for your own reference. So try as much as possible to get data to drive the article, especially from an area of the sciences in which empirical data is important. So the best option, if you don't have all your data, the best option is use your partial data. Often you might have partial data that can help already tell a story. Sometimes you have partial data that tells a story already. So that's okay. If you don't have your entire data set ready, that would be ideal. Then use your partial data. Another good option is to use data that people want to use. For example, I have a ton of data that I haven't had time to analyze. I'm just waiting for graduate students to come to me and say, hey, do you have any data for me? Yes, please, analyze this, analyze that. I even talked to them about this just a bit before class. I have all kinds of data that could drive someone's paper easily, and sometimes it's very manageable data. So you often find that in your laboratories and in your research groups and your advisors that they'll have data sets that haven't been analyzed, that still require analysis, and they'd be happy to share with you if you want to build a study around them. We have an example here, Juliana, right? Yeah. She offered to share her data, and I think we have a couple of other offers here from people who want to share their data, and that's great. Another option is, if you've done something in the past that used data, then go ahead and recycle it. Why is that not a bad thing? You think, well, aren't I plagiarizing myself? No, you're not. Because now I'm hopefully teaching you things that you didn't know before, thinking through ways to look at articles and about writing in ways that you haven't thought about before. And so when you go back to your old projects, when you write it anew, you'll be writing it hopefully in a way that you didn't write originally, thinking about a better title, a better way of structuring the introduction, and so on. So, or you can also build on, you can expand on something you've done before for your undergraduate work, or if you're a doctoral student, maybe something you did for your master's degree. And that's fine, because most of the time, many times you've done that in Portuguese. So that's totally fine, is to build on what you did before. For this class, submitting a new article written in English. Worst case scenario, you can write a review article which requires no data, a systematic review, which doesn't require any primary data that you collect, but you look at other people's data and you create a systematic review of an article. That would be fine. Some people say, I haven't even thought my topic yet. Well, if that's the case, you better think of one fast. Think of a topic and negotiate that with your orientador, with your advisor. Okay, so regarding your introductions, be careful now with the Control-C and Control-V with your entire introduction section, your literature review section, your chapter of your previous work. That's where you get into trouble. It's okay to do Control-C, Control-V of words and phrases that are useful, but when you copy yourself for something that you've created for a much bigger piece of work, an entire dissertation, entire thesis, then you get into a situation where you're trying to cram too much information in a small space. You really need to rewrite that story. You need to rethink that story. And that's why it's okay to reuse something that you've done before. Don't do this with your introduction sections. That's you. That's your lit review, and there's your article. Don't do that, because it can get very smelly in there, and very kind of disgusting. All right, so go now, and you're going to start looking at articles, hopefully in this way, breaking them down into these sections and the language that's used, and you're going to, start getting your hands dirty a little bit now. You're going to start writing the introduction to your article. Don't freak out. Don't panic. This is a good thing. And it's not going to be, this is not going to count for a grade yet. What you're going to start writing now is not going to be for next week, say, okay, you get an A, you get a B, you get a C. No. This is going to be just your first attempt. So going back to our syllabus outline, here we are today talking about, on the 5th of September, the title, the abstract introduction. Next week, we're still going to be talking about writing your introduction, but you're starting to write it today, and we're going to keep talking about it next week. And we're talking about the week after that, elements of coherence and cohesion and other things that are important for that first section. And only after that will your article be due. So on the 26th of September, write your article, your introduction will be due on the 26th of September. So you should start today though. So keep calm, write on, and look at the tools that you have in your toolbox. Remember the first day of class I said, one objective of this class is for you to have the tools. I'm not going to just try to give you an article to write for this paper, for this class, but hopefully you leave this class, this course, with a toolbox. And what do you have already? From if you were here on the first day and the second day and the third day and today, what do you already have? You've already thought about your objectives, your personal objectives, your general objectives of your research. You're familiar with some structures, some formats, of introduction. You are aware of things like they say, I say. You know about the naysayer. You know about the niche. You know what you should and should not try to copy, where you can Control-C, where you can Control-V. You're also aware, if you remember back, of some of the most typical grammar mistakes, so that you can find yourself some mistakes that are usual or quite common and how to fix them. And you can be a linguistic detective and use these tools the Google Scholar, Google Translate, all of these things that we talked about at the beginning of the second day of class, to fix those problems on your own. And you even have mentor texts, hopefully, and you will have more, to help you guide you to how to write better and give you ideas about how to say things. So make sure you have a mentor text. What you don't have yet, many of you don't have a title, so start thinking of a title. Find your mentor articles if you don't have them already, and analyze introductions of those mentor articles, and plagiarize, Control-C, Control-V, considering these linguistic features, grammar features, vocabulary features, and so on, and write your introduction. You remember this structure here, describing the same introduction. You can do the same thing now to outline your introduction using something like this. You can choose cars, or you can choose problem solution. But when you start looking at how am I going to write my introduction, you can start already outlining this way. One or the other. Don't try both. Here's what somebody wrote from last year when they first tried their introduction. I think this kind of summarizes a good spin on it. You can read that yourself. Now, hopefully, you can have a similar experience. The person emphasizes that it was an opportunity to write in English. Now, I think it's a good idea to use this class to write in English. But if you feel really uncomfortable still about writing in English, and you want to start writing in Portuguese, that's absolutely fine. And you can turn in an introduction also writing in Portuguese. That's not a problem. What I want you to do in this class is to gain an awareness of good writing, whether it's in Portuguese or in English or Mandarin, Swahili, I don't care. As long as you finish this class with an awareness of what good writing is, I'm happy. But many people will say, this is a class in English, here's my chance to make mistakes. I'm going to use this class to do it. That's fine too. Either way, you're not going to be penalized if you write in English, or rather in Portuguese rather than English. Whatever works best for you is fine. So, today, if possible, or ASAP, start working on a title for your article and your introduction with cars or problem solution, the outline. And try to start writing. Look at the way the articles in your individual areas are written, your mentor texts. How do the authors start the article? Just that. What's the first words that they use? See if you can copy something like that to start writing. Start your writing using that. Then, by next class, so by Wednesday, here's what you got to do. You should share the title and outline of what you wrote so far with your advisor. That can be just sending an email. Doesn't have to be in person. And write and keep writing. I don't know how you guys write, but one good tip for writing is don't try to do it all in one session. Write a little bit and write as much as you can or reasonably possible. Go take a shower, feed your dog, then go back and write some more. And then don't look at it again until the next day or the day after that. Then come back to it and look at it with fresh eyes. Don't try to do it all at once. Just keep writing though. Then for next class, if you're a presencial student, if you're in this auditorium, bring a printed copy of your draft introduction. Just that. If you are in the virtual group, then go ahead and print it out if you have somebody else to show it to, or sharing electronically with someone else if you can. But you should try to think of sharing your work by next week. Other people will see your introductions next week, but they'll be first drafts. They won't be finalized papers. And then informative, there'll be a space for you to describe what you went through. I should also say that there's something interesting that may be an extra motivation for you in this class, is that when this class was advertised on the Kappa Skype, the Kappa Facebook page, you had some really you had a lot of interesting comments like this one. Now, I didn't choose this because the person is saying that I'm fantastic, which of course everybody already knows. But it's the second part here about how try to think of this class as also a possible opportunity, because there are a lot of people who actually use the opportunity to really work on something nice in this class, and then later on we're able to use it for seminars and publications. And in fact, a study that I did earlier this year showed that over 20% of the people actually got something that was started in this class published in an international journal. And that was only a few months after the deadline to turn in their paper. So in other words, there's still many, in fact, over 70% that are still going to submit something that they used starting in this class. So think about how what you're writing here, you may be able to use to submit to a journal later on, in some cases. And don't forget that there are people who are waiting anytime, well, not anytime, not 3 o'clock in the morning, but during normal working hours, to help you from today onwards. So if you have any questions, if you want help with your writing, you want someone to look at what you're writing already, you can go ahead to our website, Agendar Atendimento, and book time. And there are all these people here waiting to see you with smiling faces, and they want to help you with your writing. And that's it. All right, so mãos na massa, go for it. I'll see you next week.